I thought I would start by reading some poems from mixology and then transition into some of the poems that are going to be in my new book, and then I'd finish with poems from the Big Smoke. Thank you again. So mixology is, I don't know, I wanted to be a rapper when I was a kid, and I was really bad at it. And somewhere along the way, I heard Yusuf Komunyakaa read poetry, and I thought, whatever that guy's doing, I want to do that. And so I brought this sense of enthusiasm for language from rap music into poetry, and mixology kind of, in a lot of ways, I think is the manifestation of that. This is a poem called 7 Days of Falling. And I mentioned a couple of people that I need to make sure we understand so we're all on the same page, otherwise the poem doesn't make sense anyway, but it really won't make sense if you aren't familiar with these allusions. Danny LaRusso is the name of the original Karate Kid, like Ralph Macchio in the 1984 movie. His name was Danny LaRusso. And Juan Valdez, does that name ring a bell? Because I hate to try to explain who Juan Valdez is. You know, he's sombrero, ridiculous stereotype. But I had a friend in college who made these T-shirts with Juan Valdez on them with a power fist. And I always thought that was great. So it pops up in the poem. 7 Days of Falling. Today I'm assimilating like margarine into hot cakes. I'm getting down like Danny LaRusso after the Against the Rules leg sweep. So low, I'll be a flower in common decency's lapel. Factual the way Zanzibar means sea of blacks to anyone who isn't from there. Where is Juan Valdez and his Burwest dependability when you need him? I had a homie who printed T-shirts with Juan front and center, an afro instead of a sombrero, a power fist in place of a smile, the inscription 100% Colombian. I'm going the way of skin, radio waves and thoughts like ear-to-ear transmissions grounded from the mindless space to forgetful earth. Man, my skin, it doesn't need me any more than mold needs cheese. I'm going to read for the rest of the time. I'm going to read poems from the Big Smoke. And all of the poems I'm going to read are in the voice of Jack Johnson. Thank you again for that wonderful introduction, Dan. She touched on some of the stuff that I would have said, and I know you remember all the things she said about Jack Johnson at this point. But I'll just recap a couple of them. So he became heavyweight champion in 1908. He was, of course, the first African-American heavyweight champion. His parents were slaves. So he's the first generation after emancipation. Right? So you can imagine this world where people thought his parents weren't even human. People owned his parents, and he becomes the first heavyweight champion of the world. In this same time, boxing, it wasn't like it is now, where people don't really pay attention to it. Boxing was the sort of the center of sports back then. So if you're the heavyweight champion, you're basically the toughest person in the world. And that's the way that they looked at this. So it's going to cause problems if the toughest person in the world is an African American, right? It's going to cause even more problems when the toughest person in the world is an African American with gold teeth and who's married to a white woman, who's got 2 white mistresses, and who wears all these fancy clothes and drives around in fast cars. All of these things that you are not supposed to do. Basically, he's a 21st century athlete, but he's doing this in 1910. You know, it is amazing that he made it, that somebody didn't kill him. And one of the things that I don't think I did a good job of in this book is making clear the fact that he could have been murdered any day. Any day he walked out of his house, somebody could have murdered him, and whoever did the murdering would have gotten drinks bought for him. They would have never gotten convicted for it. It would have been a celebration in some parts of the United States. Now, this isn't everybody, of course, right? But it was enough people. And so his life was in danger every single time he got into the ring. So I think about that, and I think, man, you know, he's a flawed human being like all of us are, and there are these other things that are really difficult to negotiate about his biography and his behavior. But just on a fundamental, like, level of courage, you know, like I talk stuff. I was talking about how if I met Spike Lee, I'd have all these things I'd want to say to him, but that's just talk. You know, most of us think we're more brave and more courageous than we actually are. So, all the poems I'm going to read are in Jack Johnson's voice. Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike, and since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears...
So I'm wondering, having looked at the films while you were reading the poems, so many of them were in Jack Johnson's voice, and I was wondering what the process was like watching the films and going from you watching them and thinking, he's doing this, he's doing that, to getting into his head, and whether it was, I mean, were you already in his head before you worked with the films, or no?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I mean, I'm trying to think of a really short way to answer it, because I worked on this book for 8 years, and so there were many different parts of the process. And, I researched Johnson and his life and the time that he lived in for about 2 years before I ever wrote a poem. And so I had this very defined sense of what I thought his voice was. And I also had the benefit that he's got a pretty extensive archive. Right? I mean, there are interviews, there are a few audio recordings of him. Like this has audio. At the very end, you get to hear him talking. But there's a fairly extensive textual archive for Johnson. He wrote 2 autobiographies. But the autobiographies were ghostwritten by a French guy and then translated into English. So he didn't really write them, you see what I mean? But so there were all these texts that were purporting to be Jack Johnson's voice. And so I spent a great deal of time trying to triangulate what I thought he would sound like from these ghostwritten texts, from the things that I knew were directly his voice, and then also these newspaper interviews where they would sometimes render him directly, but other times they would turn him into this kind of minstrel figure where, I shows is happy to be heavyweight champion, this kind of stuff, when he would have never, anyway, so there were these different kinds of pieces that I was trying to put together. I didn't allow myself to watch the fight films. I didn't allow myself to watch anything that wasn't related to him talking until I had what I thought was his voice for the book.